Well, former U.S. President Barack Obama has made an appeal to all South Africans to follow in Madiba's footsteps and to apply the principles of perseverance and to continue enjoying the fruits of a democratic country. He says he believes in the vision of the former president Nelson Mandela. He says this was underpinned by democracy and the fight for civil rights. But he also criticized those who questioned the legacy of Madiba.
I believe in Nelson Mandela's vision. I believe in a vision shared by Gandhi and King and Abraham Lincoln. I believe in a vision of equality and justice and freedom and multiracial democracy built on the premise that all people are created equal and they're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And I believe that a world governed by such principles is possible, and that it can achieve more peace and more cooperation in pursuit of a common good. That's what I believe. And I believe we have no choice but to move forward. That those of us who believe in democracy and civil rights and a common humanity have a better story to tell. And I believe this not just based on sentiment. I believe it based on hard evidence. The fact that the world's most prosperous and successful societies, the ones with the highest living standards and the highest levels of satisfaction among their people, happen to be those which have most closely approximated the liberal progressive ideal that we talk about, and have nurtured the talents and contributions of all their citizens. The fact that authoritarian governments have been shown time and time again to breed corruption because they're not accountable, to repress their people, to lose touch eventually with reality, to engage in bigger and bigger lies that ultimately result in economic and political and cultural and scientific stagnation. Look at history. Look at the facts. The fact that countries which rely on rabid nationalism and xenophobia and doctrines of tribal, racial, or religious superiority as their main organizing principle, the thing that holds people together, eventually those countries find themselves consumed by civil war or external war. Check the history books.
Joining us now to give us some analysis of that lecture is political analyst Angelo Fick, who's also the Director of Research at ASRI. And we're also joined by the Reverend Robert Kelly of Democrats Abroad. Good evening to you, gentlemen, and welcome to The Full View. I'll start with you, Reverend Kelly, but this speech, in a sense, I mean, particularly for you, of course, as part of the Democrats Abroad, would have brought back memories of the great orator that Barack Obama is known to be, would have brought back, I suppose, that positive sentiment that was so much a part of the legacy he left behind after his 2 terms in the White House.
Most certainly is a reflection of, he's a former university professor, so he has the ability to reflect. Looking at where you are is a function of reflection as well as assessment. And I think that's what he did today. He did it for a number of people across countries, United States of America as well as here. He could have preached the same message in New York City, and it would have probably had the same impact. It was a powerful message, and that's what he's good. Sometimes he orates, sometimes he lectures, but sometimes he delivers a message. I thought today you heard a message.
What's your response to what we heard today? Because quite often when we think about Barack Obama, he is this great orator, we know, but when you look at the substance of what is actually said, there's a lot to pick apart, you could even say.
So there is no doubt that he is a very convincing orator. He's in command of the rhetoric that he produces, and that has its own value. But it also, I think, to go back to his own words, he says, look at the historical record, look to history. And it is important for us to do so, because this isn't just about reflecting on 100 years of Nelson Mandela's life. This is also to reflect on who is being asked to reflect with us on the legacy of that 100 years. And so there were moments of great truths that were being told, but there are also moments of great irony and self-contradiction, because let us not forget, this was once the most powerful man in charge of the most powerful military on the planet, and the legacy of what that means in relation to his vision of what freedom means and who is touched by freedom and what the progress of history means, that all depends on where you sat on this globe. And if you were one of the children in Pakistan or Afghanistan who were the, victims of drone warfare, then perhaps this vision rings slightly differently. And similarly, when he says that he continues to believe in the vision of Nelson Mandela, that vision comes out of the 20th century. Ordinary South Africans in a majority young country have pointed out to us over the last 4 or 5 years their great unease with where the vision of Nelson Mandela has taken this country, and want a revisiting of that vision, not an abolition, not a dismissal of the vision, but a rearticulation of where that vision can take us and how we need to take ourselves beyond that vision because of the needs of this particular moment.
You spoke about the fact that he gave us a message today, and of course you can get lost in the symbolism of the moment. I mean, reaching out, making references to Gandhi, making references to Martin Luther King Jr., but as Angela Fick has just pointed out, Barack Obama had to do the business of governing, not just giving speeches, and that perhaps is where some of his own legacy might be questioned, might be contested at the very least.
Well, I think both men are very similar in that their entry into world politics, if you will, in their own local context, was deeply shaped by the seasons that they were in. I don't know what else Nelson Mandela could have done to introduce the kind of vision he had for the season that he was in the moment, at that moment in time. The same with Barack Obama. People wanted him to do more for African Americans in our country. They wanted him to do more on the war front, perhaps, continuation from the Bush period. But at the end of the day, the United States had been running the ground financially. We were in a deficit. Our banking system was near, it was already corrupt, but near collapse. And so I don't know, at the end of the day, when any politician takes a look at what's happening in the season, they must make a decision about which decision to make and what turn to take. And I think the similarities between both men are right on point in terms of that. Now it's easy to question after the season has ended and the politician is out of office that it was his fault that things are the way they are now. And I'm not sure about that kind of assessment.
Were they guided, Angela Fick, by a necessary pragmatism based on the moment they found themselves in, or are there real questions to be asked about, perhaps not going far enough, or were they restricted by their time?
So we're all restricted by our times, and there is no denying that to a certain extent, where these two men in their particular positions made decisions that were based on the exigencies of their own particular period. But let's not forget that in those periods they were also subject to immense amounts of critique, and not just from the conservatives and from the right wing. So I'm less interested in Barack Obama's position and the internal domestic politics of the United States. But in South Africa, certainly, during the Mandela years, there were critiques from within the country of Mandela's the first presidency, the first post-apartheid presidency. And so this is not just a matter of after the fact people started getting, questioning this. I remember in the 1990s that there were people on the left, people in progressive circles questioning the direction in which economic transformation was and wasn't going at the time. And let's not forget that we've also had work by people like Terry Bell and Dumiza Nzibeza on the unfinished business of apartheid that got abandoned late in the Mandela period. And this is not to discredit Mandela or to say that he didn't achieve something, but we must confront the, shall we say, limits of that period if we are to push ourselves beyond, as Barack Obama today called on us. So by all means, the inspiration of the Mandela vision is important, but we can't be married to that vision as if that vision is our determining map. That vision was of its time and for its time, and it must continue to inspire us in this moment for how it addressed its time. But we must not be blinded by this idea of hero worshipping and hagiography, where the words of the great man of history determines for the rest of us how we live. Many of us in South Africa, many black South Africans like myself, for years lived under this kind of measure where we're told, but Mandela wouldn't do this. Yeah. It's the same gesture we made to young people in 2016. We said, this is not Mandela's way, which was a very anemic reading of who Mandela was, because it's the reduction of a man who lived for 95 years to 10 or 15 years of his life. The firebrand of the 1950s absented from that vision. The man who was blamed or called a terrorist, not just in his own country but internationally, that man is elided from view. The prisoner of political conscience is elided from view. And I think we do ourselves a disservice to domesticate, to simplify a man whose complexity is precisely borne out by the long life that he lived in the various roles that he occupied.
And of course, I suppose part of what we'll need to reflect on is Mandela's impact on the world. Barack Obama making specific references to where the international system finds itself at this stage. And of course, he also said that Madiba's quest for true equality rings true today, just as it did decades ago. And he says one of the key lessons learned from Madiba is that South Africa and the world need to redouble the fight, particularly against inequality. Have a listen.
You know, he anticipated things. He knew what he was talking about. In 1964, before he received the sentence that condemned him to die in prison, he explained from the dock that the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, the Bill of Rights are documents which are held in veneration by Democrats throughout the world. In other words, he didn't say, well, those folks weren't written by South Africans, so I guess I can't claim them. No, he said that's part of my inheritance. That's part of the human inheritance. That applies here in this country, to me and to you. And that's part of what gave him the moral authority that the apartheid regime could never claim, because he was more familiar with their best values than they were. He had read their documents more carefully than they had. And he went on to say political division based on color is entirely artificial. And when it disappears, so will the domination of one color group by another. That's Nelson Mandela speaking in 1964 when I was 3 years old. What was true then remains true today. Basic truths do not change. It is a truth that can be embraced by the English and by the Indian, by the Mexican, and by the Bantu, and by the Luo, and by the American. It is a truth that lies at the heart of every world religion, that we should do unto others as we'd have them do unto us. That we see ourselves in other people, that we can recognize common hopes and common dreams. And it is a truth that is incompatible with any form of discrimination based on race or religion or gender or sexual orientation. And it is a truth that, by the way, when embraced, actually delivers practical benefits, since it ensures that a society can draw upon the talents and energy and skill of all its people. And if you doubt that, just ask the French football team that just won the World Cup. Because not all of those folks looked like Gauls to me, but they're French.
That was, of course, the 45th President of the United States. If you're just joining us, we're in discussion with political analyst Angelo Fick, who's the director of the Orwell Socioeconomic Research Institute, and the Reverend Robert Kelly of the Democrats Abroad. And that part of that speech, and I'll start with you, Angelo, was obviously about part of what we know Barack Obama to be, a man who stands for inclusivity, a man who stands for people coming together. And he spoke about the credibility of the international system being questioned now that the politics of fear were back, the politics of resentment are beginning to dominate how people think around the world. And perhaps no matter what else his shortcomings might be, at least on that score, one could give him some credit.
Well, I'm not giving the man credit. I mean, it was a particularly well done lecture with all sorts of really good insights. And this return to the atmosphere of the 1930s, the creeping rise of fascism in places that hadn't seen it in 70 to 80 years, is a global moment because the consequences are global. This is no longer just about what's happening in one tiny corner of the world. That kind of rise of ethnocentrism, of fascism, has consequences because it has economic and policy decisions made on it. So the biggest challenge that we face, which is what our scientists and philosophers have been telling us for nearly a generation, is global climate change. And this kind of infantilizing and quite infantile ethnocentrism and racist vision that's coming out of the most powerful military empire on the planet will have consequences. So the Trump presidency's decisions around the environmental protections and what it will suspend have consequences for the rest of us who live on this planet. And so it is really a matter of all of us or none of us. And the articulation of this in these racialized and raciological terms, which Barack Obama is talking about, is damaging at the everyday level, right? So the way in which immigrant children are separated from their parents, the ways in which migrants are allowed to drown in the Mediterranean, but they're not inconsequent. They're not the consequence of decisions made inside the empire, because the instabilities and economic insecurities and security insecurities of East Africa that results in these millions of people trying to flee, all of those issues in Syria, coming out of Iraq, coming out of Southwest Asia more generally, are the consequences of decisions made a generation ago and of the bombing over what is now almost 30 years of one part of the world by another part of the world. So this business of simply laying out the landscape is great, but we must also always implicate ourselves in it because we're not innocents. And Barack Obama is not an innocent bystander to how we get to the Trumpian moment, how we get to this moment of insecurity in the world.
And I'll come back to you then, Reverend, in terms of where America finds itself right now. I mean, obviously convention, I suppose, prevents him from being directly critical of the Trump presidency and certainly the things that we've been hearing come out of America today. But it's a very different world to the one he was president, when he was president, rather, Barack Obama. How does the world negotiate in terms of the tone that he said? The democracy is messy, but we all need to stand up. We all need to fight for what we believe in. How does the rest of the world negotiate that moment when it is America who seems, in some ways, to be quite aggressive in its stance?
Ooh, Bagani, that's a lot. But let me touch on each component of what you said. In his lecture today, I think the man did talk about common truths, common principles, and based on that, Africa, South Africa, and America should be building a bridge. That we should learn from each other's challenges and dynamics around citizenship. Because if the issue is about leadership, it must first be about citizenship. Because poor citizenship will never give you great leadership. And I think for the most part, the argument that's going on here is now about how do we remove our country's dynamics, and as people, African people, American people, black people in America, the diaspora, how do we as a collective, millions of people, not just a couple of leaders. The issue is not Mr. Trump. The issue is about those who put him in office. The citizenry that elected him and put him in that space. He didn't just walk in that space by himself. regardless of what he claims to have in terms of billions of assets here and there and ownership of properties here and there, which nobody seems to really know about. But at the end of the day, we somehow, as people, put people in office and we treat them like gods. And when they do wrong, we turn our face the other way because of their family affiliation or because they helped us in the struggle and strive for freedom. Sometimes I feel like people who have brought freedom to certain countries now hold those same people hostage over the way they want to run the regime. And just because you're a freedom fighter doesn't necessarily mean you're a president or a politician. Barack Obama had his own challenges coming out of a blended family situation, black father from Africa, white mother from America, raised by parents. So we all are prodigies of our culture and where we come from. I found that the great similarities around the two men, and this is the discussion of the day for me, is that they were both peace-minded, born generations, countries apart, but they had a peace focus. You had to push these men to war, essentially. They were more guided by the call for a better humanity. And I think that's the debate of the day. Do we want a better humanity, and how does that come about? And can we put it on a couple of folks to do that? Can we put it on an ex-president and a current president that doesn't seem to be doing very well in the United States? Can we put it on a new president in South Africa?
He made a reference, Angelo, to the words that we heard from Francis Fukuyama about the end of history in 1989 and how it was almost assumed that liberal democracies would thrive, certainly at least in the model of the Western world. That seems to be in danger, and he was warning specifically today about strong men and, benign dictatorship-type leadership that'll maybe give you a good economy, but will take away your rights. A good warning to heed?
It's a good warning, but it's a warning that was there when Francis Fukuyama uttered those words. I mean, Noam Chomsky challenged it, various other people around the world challenged this notion that Western European models of democracy and in the Anglo-American dominance between, that notion of democracy was necessarily the highest point of development, and challenged this and said, in 200,000 years of human development, in 8,000 years of civilization, why would this system that has a particular moment of etiology and a particular moment of instantiation, why would that be the eternal system? And why would that system be everybody's system? And I don't think that Barack Obama was making that claim quite so crudely today. In fact, he was setting up Fukuyama for challenge and for interrogation by suggesting that that vision actually didn't come true. And that what we saw throughout the 90s, because while Fukuyama was making this argument, the rest of world history, to quote Gayatri Spivak, continued. Right? So you had the disbanding of the Russian Empire, and not just the Soviet Empire, but the Russian Empire and its rearticulation. You had the arising of China in a different form, and you had these kind of post-colonial situations in Africa. But let's not forget, at the end of that, you had Rwanda, you had Yugoslavia, you had all sorts of political and economic shifts. If that was indeed the end of history, if that was the model we would be all striving for and getting to, then the 2008 economic collapse would not have happened. But precisely because that wasn't the end, and we are not at the end. And that's what I think we need to be very, very cognizant of in South Africa, that the political system can never be static. The moment it becomes fixed, ossified, etched in stone, it cannot meet new challenges because it is stuck in the 18th century or stuck in 1994. And by no means in South Africa can we afford to have ourselves return to 1994 and reiterate the mistakes that followed from 1994. Celebrate the successes, build on them. But the Rainbow Nation concept failed. The idea of reconciliation between people who were never together failed. We need to try something else. And that, I think, was also one of the lessons we can take from Mandela's life. He didn't continue to try the same old thing.
Right.
The vision of the 1950s, the defiance campaigns, was not what he reiterated in the 1960s when he called for an armed struggle. He did not reiterate the armed struggle vision in the 1990s when he needed to do something else. In other words, our political vision, our idea of the future, our utopian ideals must shift with the times, the materials, and what we know at that time.
And of course, the burning question of our time has to be inequality, not only in this country, but around the world, which is one of the themes that Obama touched on today, criticizing the widening gap between the rich and poor around the globe. He said the greatest blessing is to be able to live a life where you can help others and not just yourself.
When economic power is concentrated in the hands of the few, history also shows that political power is sure to follow, and that dynamic eats away at democracy. Sometimes it may be straight out corruption, but sometimes it may not involve the exchange of money. It's just folks who are that wealthy get what they want, and it undermines human freedom. And Mandela understood this. This is not new. He warned us about this. He said, where globalization means, as it so often does, that the rich and the powerful now have new means to further enrich and empower themselves at the cost of the poor and the weaker, then we have a responsibility to protest in the name of universal freedom. That's what he said. So if we are serious about universal freedom today, if we care about social justice today, then we have a responsibility to do something about it. And I would respectfully amend what Mandela said. I don't do it often, but I'd say it's not enough for us to protest. We're going to have to build. We're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to figure out how do we close this widening chasm of wealth and opportunity, both within countries and between them. And how we achieve this is going to vary country to country. And I know your new president is committed to rolling up his sleeves and trying to do so. But we can learn from the last 70 years that it will not involve unregulated, unbridled, unethical capitalism. It also won't involve old-style command and control socialism from the top. That was tried. It didn't work very well. For almost all countries, progress is going to depend on an inclusive market-based system, one that offers education for every child, that protects collective bargaining and secures the rights of every worker, that breaks up monopolies to encourage competition in small and medium-sized businesses, and has laws that root out corruption and ensures fair dealing in business, that maintains some form of progressive taxation so that rich people are still rich, but they're given a little bit back to make sure that everybody else has something to pay for universal health care and retirement security.
Reverend Kelly, I'll get your closing remark with us this evening. I mean, he kind of echoed Martin Luther King at one point around that famous quote about, the moral universe being long, but that the arc bends towards justice in the end. When he talks there about an inclusive economy that encourages education, that encourages opportunity for all, I mean, can we get that just world? Can we get that world that he says we all still need to fight for?
I think we can. But I don't think it relies on one individual in one generation. I think sort of this Martin Luther King concept of the dream, if you will, it has to be a dream and a realistic vision that has a redefined context in its time, but still the same goal. And I think that's what perhaps parties are about. We've had some great disappointments in the United States in terms of party politics. We think the Republicans, because they're guys in the White House essentially, that they also have a mandate to, while he's the greater among equals, to put him in check, to make sure that he's abiding by the Republican dream. I'm not sure what dream we're in right now. It's almost a nightmare. But nevertheless, I think Barack Obama got essence of a dream from many other dreamers. Mahatma Gandhi and King and Nelson. And then there are probably people right now in this next election in the United States will say, let's pick up this dream and let's run with it. It's possible, But I don't think it's on one people. I think it's on one culture, one society that says we want this to happen.
So it's about coming together, and I'll ask you the same question in a sense, because he also spoke about closing chasms between and within countries. And how do we get that idea right? How do we make sure that the moral arc of the universe does bend towards justice?
Well, that I think was for many South Africans one of the high moments of irony in this particular lecture, that he spoke about the vast differences in wealth in the most unequal society in the world. And, you know, on stage with him is Patrice Motsepe, who is worth 25 billion rand, last check, and the President of the Republic of South Africa, who is worth 6.4 billion, when an average old age pensioner gets 1,600 rand and has to make a living in the same country, in which the President of the country can say, we want you to tighten your belts, we are going to increase the petrol price, but we don't want you to increase the price of your goods and services. That kind of inequality, I think, is what rings for most people in this moment in history. It's not alone in South Africa, it's a global phenomenon. Otherwise, why would we have the millions of refugees that we have, that one in every 122 people alive at the moment is a refugee? So that kind of vision of inequality, I agree with Barack Obama. I think where millions of people, if not billions of people, will disagree with him is the way in which we're going to get there. Because when I think he strikes the right tone is when he says democracy is not top-down, democracy is bottom-up. And too often what we are told in public discourse, and not by Obama today, is to worship the big men and to find the next big hero. So you don't like this president, find the next president. And here I agree with Reverend Kelly. It is about how thousands and millions of people in their communities are going to struggle to make sure that the values of equality, democracy and human dignity live, and not continue to look for the next big man who's going to be the savior. Because as Nelson Mandela reminded us when he was a member of the ANC, he did his struggles inside the ANC. And it was not just some kind of messianic, Jesus, savior-like position. He was actually a member of an organization, and the struggle was collective, and it was with millions of people involved in bringing about the kinds of changes that he envisioned, foresaw, and that he took vision from them, and they took vision from him. It's a dialogic process. This idea of looking for the great man who's going to save us, that's done. We cannot have the big man politics in the world anymore. The record of history, as Barack Obama points out, is execrable. It's appalling of big men who come up nice but actually turn out to be quite appalling. And
as we've seen in his case, even if they have great ideas, those can quickly be reversed at the end of their term. Well, we've been in some discussion with political analyst Angelo Fick, Director of Research at ASRI, and the Reverend Robert Kelly from the Democrats Abroad. Stay with us. We've got more news and discussions after this quick break.